Well, the 1CG initiative is one of the major initiatives that the 1CG system started recently. And we, in connection to that, we thought it's a good idea to launch so-called Nexus Gain Talks. And that's the first of the series. And we are very excited about that and very looking forward to good presentations and good interactions. Nexus Gains is about realizing gains between water, energy, food, and ecosystems, and really understanding the interlinkages between these different systems and finding ways to more optimally manage them in a more coordinated manner, in a more following a systems approach and in a more effective way. So, for instance, further developing water resources, for instance, for food production without jeopardizing environmental health. That's one of the examples. We work in different river basins worldwide, in the Indus Basin, in the Ganges Basin, the Aral Sea Basin in Central Asia, but also in East and Southern Africa, the Blue Nile, as well as in river basins in Southern Africa. Today, the focus is on the Ganges River Basin, in particular, the work we are doing in India and in Nepal. I think I said enough, and the main objectives of this series, just to mention one more thing, is that we on the one hand, we would like to present first results, would like to discuss research approaches that we are doing, so it's very much the focus on science and innovations. But on the other hand, it's also about trying to understand how we link from the beginning effectively to policymaking processes, how do we link to capacity or other impact pathways to overall increase the impact of our research. But it's not only about presenting results of Nexus Gains. We will in this series also have the opportunity to listen to other colleagues who work on related topics, either researchers or colleagues from the policy arena, helping us to frame our work better. With this, let's start with the first speaker. We have two speakers. Each of them was asked to speak for 15 minutes, colleagues. Yeah, 15, 1-5, not 5-0. And it's a real pleasure to introduce the first speaker of today. And I see him already online. It's Shilp Verma. Shilp is a senior researcher for water, energy, food policies here at the International Water Management Institute. He's based in Anand in India, and he will give a presentation about water, energy, food nexus in action, building on 2 decades of work in the Ganga Basin and beyond. Over to you, Shilp. Thanks.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me and see my slides.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Okay, thanks, Stefan. And actually, I should start by just admitting that I initially thought that this would be basically a meeting of Nexus Gains team. And we'll mostly be talking to each other. And my idea of this presentation was to just explain to the team members from other basins and other countries how specifically the context in India in Ganga Basin has kind of guided our work on this theme in the last 2 decades. But I'm also happy to see so many new faces on the call, and I hope that I can learn from all of you over this meeting, but also in future events. Water, energy, food nexus is something that the EME has been working on in India since I joined, and perhaps even before I joined. I started working in 2001, and at that time itself, one of the key kind of themes that EME India was working on was to highlight the importance of groundwater in India's irrigation economy, which seemed initially strange because from the day that I started working, everybody I talked to or whatever I read kept on saying this. But somehow among the policymakers, irrigation still meant canals and dams and irrigation systems, or public irrigation systems, which are mostly gravity flow systems. What we have seen since the 1970s is that the share of those public irrigation systems has gone down significantly. Today, more than 70% of India's irrigation relies on groundwater. And because of that, partly because of that, energy becomes very important. So the theme that we started working on, at that time we used to call it energy irrigation nexus. But it was always linked to food or agriculture. So the water, energy, food nexus theme has been consistent throughout. Now, my first slide, I'm basically going to show the point that I was making, that India's irrigation economy is huge. India is the world's largest user of groundwater. There are various estimates of how much groundwater India pumps every year. But the most commonly accepted ones are anywhere between 250 to 280 cubic kilometers. The first map on the left, each red dot on that map represents 5,000 wells and tube wells. And there are over 20 million of them. And they're spread all over. There is hardly any part of the country where groundwater is not being pumped. And these are only the ones for irrigation. In addition to this, there are plenty of wells and tube wells which are pumping groundwater for drinking water supplies as well as for industrial use. The second map basically talks about the energy divide. The red or the dark orange parts of that map are the areas where more than 60, 70, 80% of the irrigation wells are electric and they run on electricity. In many cases, this electricity is provided free of cost to farmers. In other cases, the farmers do pay some token tariff, but it's highly subsidized. Nowhere in this part do farmers pay the commercial tariff. The yellow parts in the map are actually the less fortunate farmers of India, because here less than 20% of the irrigation wells are electrified, and the others are mostly diesel or kerosene run, which are not subsidized. So diesel is not subsidized anymore for several years now in India, and the farmers have to pay a very high cost of running their pumps, and that basically defines how this nexus operates. And I will talk about it a bit more. But just as for the context, the red parts, which have about 15 or 16 million electric wells and tube wells, they receive anywhere between 15 and 20 billion US dollars of farm power subsidy every year. So every pump roughly receives $1,000 of subsidy. And that's the energy that they get either for free or at very highly subsidized rates. And the result of this farm power policy can be seen in the third map, where the red parts highlight the areas which are suffering severe groundwater depletion. And they're all in this, in the part which receive these subsidies. The Eastern India part is also naturally better endowed in water resources. But because of lack of affordable access to energy, groundwater is underused, irrigation is scarcely used, and therefore productivity is low and poverty is high. So that basically defines the nexus in India. Now, but this nexus also extends to other parts of South Asia. In Pakistan, I think there are 1.4 or 1.5 million wells and tube wells. Out of those, 1.1 are in Pakistan, Punjab, which is the agricultural hub of the country. These are significantly larger in size than India, also because land holdings are much larger in Pakistan. But very few of them are actually electric. And the interesting part from the energy water food nexus is that despite having so much recharge from canal, Pakistan has the world's largest contiguous irrigation system, and also despite not having any farm power subsidies. So these are diesel pumps which pay a significant marginal cost of pumping. Even then, farmers in Pakistan have managed to deplete groundwater, and that's kind of a mystery for at least for us who are working in India. Bangladesh is similar to Eastern India. They have plenty of rainfall, good shallow aquifers, but they have some pockets of depletion, and they have problems of groundwater quality or arsenic, and that is a constraint on the groundwater use. The energy demand in Nepal is relatively lower, especially in the hill parts, but whatever little demand is there, it is in the Terai region, concentrated in the Terai region. So this nexus extends to whole of South Asia, but also, as I show, to other parts of the world. Now, this is from a 2018 paper which talks about 8 different kinds of energy groundwater interaction settings in South Asia. I'm not going to go into the details, but broadly, depending on the energy policies or the energy regime and the groundwater situation, whether it is scarce groundwater, abundant groundwater, shallow, deep aquifers, and the amount of water use in agriculture or the irrigation intensity of agriculture. This paper has basically classified them. Two broad regions for India are the Western and Peninsular one, which has subsidized farm power leading to groundwater overexploitation, I just talked about, and eastern part, the yellow part in this map, which has abundant groundwater but energy scarcity. There are a few exceptions, Gujarat and Punjab in India, where there's actually intelligent rationing of farm power. I will talk about it a bit later. And then the other exception is Sri Lanka and Kerala in India, where farmers have already moved to high value agriculture. Also, the rainfall is much higher there. So even commercial tariffs of energy do not create a problem for farmers. Now, but this kind of nexus also extends to other parts of the world, and we've done some. Largely, this is based on literature. But if you look at the situation in Iran, it's similar. Since the 1970s, the groundwater pumping has increased significantly in Iran, from less than 50,000 wells to more than 1 million by 2016. 85% of the wheat that the farmers produce is procured by the government at tariffs which are probably higher than the world market price. And that has also caused, similar to Western and Peninsular India and other parts of South Asia, that is the cause of groundwater depletion, roughly at 1 meter per annum. But it also leads to salinization of soil. And the kanats, which were traditional irrigation systems, have basically gone into disrepair because of groundwater depletion. Now, various things have been tried by the government, including issuing well permits, regulating the total acreage under wheat, limiting the pump size that the farmers have, and limiting pumping hours. But the results have been mixed. It has been difficult to enforce strict regulations. I think that is common to most developing countries. The enforcement capacity is smaller with the government, and also there are a large number of small users, which increases the transaction cost of enforcement. There's also a very strong political economy. At every time there is, it's time for elections, the illegal tube wells, which don't have permits, they get regularized, and that leads to basically worsening of the situation. Also, basically, most governments have realized that large-scale shift away from wheat is untenable. Also, because of the geopolitics, I think Iran, because of sanctions, they have to have self-sufficiency of wheat production, and that has also driven these policies. So, one lesson from this is, like in South Asia, water, energy, food policies and goals can often be at cross purpose, and basically, depending on if we try and understand the response of farmers respond to protect their incomes, not to save water or energy in the short run at least. Similar is the situation in Saudi Arabia. Actually, it's worse in Saudi Arabia. One paper actually argued that Saudi Arabia invested more than $80 billion between 1980 and 2000 to produce food which could have been bought from the open market for $40 billion and ended up actually exporting 12.4 billion cubic meters of virtual water after so much of wheat was produced locally. Here also, there were several kind of restrictions that were put, but they have failed. Also because of the political economy in the region. I'm not going into the details of all of these because we have limited time, but I'll be happy to have a discussion later on. The situation in Mexico is also interesting. Mexico also has very large use of groundwater in agriculture. Again, heavily subsidized farm power and virtual water exports. Very similar problem to India and South Asia. Mexico has tried several ways of regulating groundwater use, which failed. Then they did this community-based self-governance system called quotas, which also worked, I think, initially, but then could not sustain. And now they've also, most recently, they've also tried pricing, which has had some impact in the short run, but again, it seems untenable in the long run. Similar is the case with China. Despite having a much stronger state and enforcement capacity, China has been struggling to basically limit groundwater use in North China Plains, which is its agricultural hub. And again, several things have been tried: ban on tube wells, check on crops which are grown, giving incentives to farmers to move away from wheat. But none of them seem to have worked on large scale. There have been pockets of success stories, but we haven't really found a large-scale solution to this problem of co-managing the water, energy, and food sectors. Now, some of EME's early work in India tried to focus on this. I already mentioned the farmers basically get subsidized power. But because they get subsidized power and because 18, 19, 20% of the total energy consumption goes into agriculture, basically utilities are forced to ration the amount of power supply that farmers get. And that's what used to happen. So from the early days when farmers used to get 20, 22 hours of power, eventually it was depleted to 16 hours, 12 hours, and most recently 6 to 7 hours. Now, farmers were unhappy because of this, because even though they were getting free power, it was highly unreliable, it was poor quality, the voltage was bad, they were suffering pump burnout, motor burnout, and that is really not ideal situation, if, especially in the peak irrigation season, when all the farmers want to run their pumps at the same time. The conventional wisdom suggested to impose a high marginal cost. All of these farmers, because they were not paying any tariff, the argument was that if you impose a high marginal cost, you universally meter all the farmers and then impose a high tariff, then that will lead to more efficient groundwater use. And ADB actually put on hold a 350 million power sector loan because the government had failed to implement universal metering of agricultural tube wells. However, the chief ministers in almost every state were even scared to talk about imposing universal metering on farmers or introducing any reforms in tariffs. Actually, 3 or 4 chief ministers at that time lost elections because they tried to basically introduce reforms in agriculture power tariffs. And the situation was going from bad to worse. Not only were farmers unhappy, the utilities were bleeding money because the farm power subsidies kept on rising as the power supply became more unreliable. Farmers resorted to installing auto switches because sometimes the power would come in the middle of the night. The farmers did not want to get up and go to the field at that time, so they installed auto switches, which led to even more wastage, and more wasteful use led to more depletion. More depletion meant farmers needed more units of power to pump the same amount of groundwater. So the farm power subsidies kept on basically rising. A collateral damage of this was that even the non-agriculture users, households, rural industries, they started suffering. Because farm power or rural power supply was rationed, they also could not get power throughout the day. Now, in Gujarat, the government actually came up with an idea of introducing some, what we call later, in retrospect, actually, intelligent rationing of farm power. But they did not advertise it as such. They basically said that our villages are suffering because villages or rural households are not unable to get 24/7 power. Why shouldn't villages get the same amenities as our cities are getting? And basically, the chief minister pushed this policy of separating agriculture and non-agriculture feeders with this as the motto, that we are doing all of this not to limit power supply to farmers, but to extend more or better electricity service to other or to villagers in general. And that meant that something that no other state was able to introduce, Gujarat managed to implement with very little resistance from farmers. Because the women in the households were big supporters of this program because they could get better energy access in their houses. The rural industries were also supporting this. And since Gujarat did this in 2005-06 over a period of 18 months, they rewired the whole countryside. Gujarat utilities have been among there are 4 utilities in Gujarat, and they have been among the top 5 performance consistently among all the electricity utilities in India. And this was the report that EME did, which actually triggered this discussion. But actually, the solution, Nexus solution that the government introduced, actually went a few steps further from what EME had recommended. And actually, it Some people argue that Mr. Modi, who was the chief minister then, one of the reasons why he became so popular and eventually became the Prime Minister of India was things like this that he did in Gujarat. Now, in the new context, solar pumps are going to completely reconfigure this nexus, and that's why some of our recent work has been focused on solar pumps. But before that, in Eastern India, which is a very different situation, EMI's work has been basically arguing that improving poor farmers' access to groundwater through improved energy can actually lead to significant poverty outcomes and improvements in agricultural GDP. Again, one major other factor is that only 1 in 3 farmers have their own irrigation, which means that there is also a significant informal market or irrigation service market through which non-well owners are also able to access. And again, energy policies can be tweaked to improve the access of even non-well owning farmers or water buyers to improve irrigation. Now, our work on solar basically started in 10-11 when government started subsidizing solar pumps.
Can you round it up? Sorry,
yeah.
Sorry for pushing. We have 2 speakers. Sorry for this.
Sure. Our work on solar basically, again, focused on 2 aspects, different work in Eastern and Western India. I'm going to skip this part, but more than 95% of the solar capacity for irrigation is right now in India and in Bangladesh. And that's why solar pumps are basically rising at a rapid pace. One estimate said that the growth in number of solar pumps is at roughly 65% per year. So our one pilot in Western India, which is a water-scarce situation, and the danger of solar pumps is that they can lead to even more pumping of groundwater, because again, they offer basically the equivalent of free power. One pilot that we tried was to basically connect these solar pumps that the farmers are getting to the grid and incentivize them to evacuate whatever power they don't want to use for irrigation to the grid and earn income from it. And we call this solar power as remunerative crop. This has worked quite well in our pilot, and now the government of Gujarat as well as the government of India are trying to scale it up as part of a national program. There is a plan to install 1.5 million grid-connected solar pumps, broadly inspired by this model. In Eastern India, our work has been, again, a derivative of our work on irrigation service markets, and we have tried to see whether solar irrigation service providers can actually be used to catalyze efficient and equitable irrigation service markets. The key lessons so far have been that solar pumps are just more than just clean pumping solutions. They can transform and will transform food systems by enabling a shift to irrigated agriculture for rain-fed regimes, mostly in Africa, make irrigation more affordable and equitable in countries like India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, enhance resilience and possibly fix the perverse incentives, all of this while reducing carbon footprint. Asia and Africa are following very different strategies for solarization, and there is huge potential for South-South learning. And the early experiments that are going on right now, and some of which we'll also do as part of Nexus Gains, can basically offer lessons for developing a roadmap for effective, equitable, and sustainable solarization of agriculture.
Super. Sure. Thanks. So we have to move on. You have
Can I take 1 more minute?
You take it from Musa now.
Yeah. Sorry. This is the work that we are planning now. In 3 villages in Bihar and in Jharkhand, we are going to try 3 different models. One where we are going to do large number of small solar irrigation pumps. One where we'll have the solar entrepreneur model, where each pump will service several farmers. And one where we'll have a centralized solar PV system, which will supply energy to agriculture, but also to other users. And what we want to do is try and understand the impacts on agriculture and socioeconomics of these 3 different models, and hopefully use these lessons to guide future policies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's so much to say, and of course, 20 years of experience to review in 15 minutes is a big challenge. You know, I'm afraid because we have to keep the time, and I saw a super lively chat, which is nice, and a lot of good discussion. I'm sorry, but we have to move on to the next speaker that she also has some time. And colleagues, please reach out to Shilp directly to answer your questions. And also a pleasure to introduce our second speaker of today is Dr. Musa Alvi. She's a researcher at the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, in the Division of Environment and Production Technology. She modified her title from the working title we had in the invitation, and you see it in front of you. And without further taking any of your time, I hand over to Musa. Please, Musa.
Thanks, Stefan. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Oh, excellent. So as Stefan mentioned, I have taken the liberty of changing my title a little bit, and I'll be talking about, as part of work package 3 of the Nexus Gains Initiative, what are the different survey and research approaches that we are planning to employ to understand intra-household and community level water, energy, food interdependencies in order to inform more effective policy making. So very quickly, what the sort of broad aim of this presentation is. First is to sort of introduce you to our plans for implementation of these large surveys in year 1, at least in Nepal, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, and India. We also want to sort of present to the larger community that is present here the core indicators that we are planning to measure and solicit feedback on whether there are any measures that we should be adding to help answer the questions that we are aiming to answer through these surveys. That we also want to hear from others in other work packages and Nexus Gains on how our surveys can inform your work. Are there any indicators, any modules that you would like us to introduce in the surveys that could help inform some of the work that you're doing under work packages 1, 2, 4, and 5. And finally, I know 15 minutes is not enough, but hopefully to spark a little bit of discussion on what are the interventions that can take place in these areas where we are doing our surveys to ensure that we can measure changes in these indicators that we are measuring. So what kind of forms can those interventions take? And Shilp kind of touched upon a couple of those that we are hoping to draw. So what is the central motivation for conducting these large surveys across our initiative geographies? First, we need a baseline assessment of energy use and needs in the household, on farm and off farm. And we need to understand what constrains the use of improved water and energy sources and effective groundwater management. And the hope is that we can then use this data to design interventions, whether they are technology or input focused, whether they are finance or credit related interventions, behavioral or information related, or a mix, to address and relax these constraints and hopefully to sort of measure over time how these work. These surveys will be done in 3 phases in the sense there's a baseline, a midline, and end line. And the idea behind having multiple rounds of data collection is to allow for midline course correction if we find something is not working or something that is working well and we want to expand it. In addition, as those of you who have read the proposal will note that there's been a general sort of call for more research in assessing impacts of CGIAR's investments in water research. And this is in addition to, a general sort of lack of information and data on the gender and intra-household benefits of alternative household and agriculture energy sources. As part of our commitments to One CGIAR, we are also mandated to track a series of CGIAR impact areas as well as gender indicators. And while unfortunately we don't fully know what the extent of and which of these indicators and what the extent of this reporting will be, we know that our reporting responsibilities will be underpinned by solid data and sort of a solid data collection strategy. So what are there are 3 main research questions that we are hoping to answer through these surveys. First is, of course, as I mentioned, what is the state of use, access, and knowledge of different energy sources and how it is being used within the household and in the community. The second is, what are the ways in which women's agency and empowerment can be strengthened by improving access to improved energy? And what are the mechanisms and pathways for this improvement? And Shilp made a very interesting point about how there was buy-in from women for this sort of improved a program of electricity delivery and how that actually can potentially increase take up and acceptance more broadly in the communities. I think it's important to address these. And in select geographies, we are also hoping to study how access to solar powered irrigation improves yields, allows production diversity, improves or doesn't improve sustainable groundwater use, and as Shilp mentioned, can overall lead to equitable and inclusive agricultural economic growth. So trying to sort of replicate what IMI is doing in Bihar in a couple of other geographies as well on small and large scales. As I mentioned, our aim is that through this baseline, midline, and endline, we can track a series of key indicators over time and over 3 or 4 main geographies where we are working. And for some of these indicators, we may realize that we need to supplement our efforts with more higher frequency data collection, especially if there are any shocks or crises that happen in this interim period. We may want to see what the impacts of these shocks are, what are the resilience strategies being employed, and whether sort of any interim subsidies or benefits are reaching farmers as a response to the shock and crisis. I wanted to at the outset show you what these indicators are, and we are looking for suggestions on improving this list, both in terms of which indicators to measure, which indicators to add, as well as if you had any more suggestions on how to measure these indicators. And I say this because a lot of times we kind of discuss who in the household should be targeted with questions about which component. And men and women the person who's making all the decisions on the farm versus the person who's a de facto head of household can tend to give very different answers to some of these questions. So both at the community level as well as within the household, deciding how to structure these questions to really get at the best possible answer. Those are both points that we sort of want to think about. So our main impact indicators are covered under 5 broad heads. We are collecting information on nutrition, health, and food security. So that covers sort of food security and dietary diversity. We're also looking at measures of poverty reduction, improvements in jobs and livelihood. Gender, youth, and inclusion is a central part of sort of the One CGIAR strategy. And as I mentioned again, the need to understand women's preferences, access to information, and their demands for household and agriculture energy use is important. And we also want to capture changes in women's empowerment. And of course, climate adaptation and ecosystem health and biodiversity are central to the work we're doing. In addition, we are also going to, of course, have a rich set of demographic variables that capture demographic information at the household level, community surveys, but we are also going to be measuring access to agricultural extension, both formal and informal, through social networks, awareness and adoption about various climate smart ag practices, access to finance and insurance and credit, land access and access to land titles. In certain geographies, remittance and migration are an important determinant of agricultural investments, and that's going to be a part of our survey as well. And finally, experiences of shocks and stressors, as well as sort of potential resilience to future shocks and stressors where it can be. So it's going to be a large survey, and we may need to think about sort of how to structure it so that we get good quality answers. There's no respondent fatigue, while allowing us to sort of measure all of these indicators that we are hoping to measure. So what are some of the innovations that we can do, and how do we test for impacts? Shilp mentioned again some of these. So the first is, of course, technology and input, right? We could test new machines, solar pumps, as well as new ways of delivering subsidies. And that can be one innovation. The other is to look at governance, changes in governance structure, especially of shared resources like groundwater. As part of Work Package 4, we'll be looking at behavioral games, and that is one way to kind of reformulate governance structures of shared resources. We may also want to test new and innovative financial products. These could be related to credit, these could be related to insurance or bundled products. We may also want to look at new ways of data collection, and really I haven't thought this through yet and open to sort of suggestions, but looking at how well our surveys triangulate with data that we are capturing, say, through remote sensing, to allow us to basically be able to capture data more accurately without needing to do physical surveys every time. I think that's one place to innovate. And then finally, I think it's important to also look at new ways of reaching farmers with information. And this is not just, I'm not really just talking about agricultural information, but also looking at different ways of extension delivery. So the content of the information as well as the way it is delivered. And also looking at sort of behavior change communication that addresses some of the non-physical constraints to adoption of new technology. And these could be, risk aversion, aversion to ambiguity, and also looking at a mix of different interventions. So extension bundled with financial products, or technology bundled with extension and finance. These are some of the ways in which we should probably be thinking about how we can innovate in the areas in which we work. And some of the ways in which we do it is through pilot studies, through randomized control trials, through field experiments. I think field experiments are increasingly becoming popular to test behavioral constraints, especially. So those are just some things to sort of keep in mind. I want to take some time to kind of underpin why gender and inclusion is important in Nexus research, and how we should be integrating these questions into the work that we do. We need to include gender in our research because we know that women's preferences regarding energy technology choices are different. Women have different role within the household and within the community in where they're able to make decisions and where their decisions are heard. We also want to increase women's involvement in sort of this water, energy, food space in meaningful ways. And this is especially critical in areas where male out migration is seeing women become de facto heads of households. How to empower women to be able to be more involved and take more meaningful decisions in agriculture in the absence of men. The fourth point, does female empowerment in agriculture lead to more efficient and desirable outcomes, is not really a question. We know that it does. And not just more desirable agricultural outcomes. Empowered women make better nutritional choices, make better investments in the girl children and in the health and education of their children. And so there are broader sort of benefits to investing in women farmers. And we also should sort of be cognizant that sometimes adoption of new agriculture technology could have adverse impacts on women and children, especially as it relates to time poverty and demands on women's time that's already quite overstretched. And so that's something to sort of keep in mind. And finally, I think our aim really with buy-in from policymakers should be to be able to suggest at the end of this sort of time period, that how policies and instruments can be tweaked or designed better to improve women's access and participation. Just to sort of give you a quick example, in India, all subsidies, agricultural subsidies, are tied to land ownership, require you to show proof of land title to be able to receive a range of government benefits related to agriculture. Women and tenanted farmers, who are often the poorest, probably most in need of subsidized agricultural input and information, are the ones who are least likely to have access to land ownership and land titles. So how do we sort of reformulate existing subsidies to be more inclusive to farmers who may not have all of this paperwork or maybe constrained in other ways? I think the ultimate aim should be to be able to do something like that. Also, a narrow focus on just looking at men and women ignores important intersectionalities. That is especially true in South Asia, and I'm sure it is in different geographies as well. So caste, for example, is an important determinant of access to government officials, access to schemes, access to information, what kind of jobs you do, including where you live in the household, whether you have access to the village pump, hand pump or not. All is determined in large part by caste. And so I think just looking at men and women while ignoring these sort of other identities that sometimes may even overpower divisions based on gender, I think is something we need to keep in mind when we are working in these geographies where ethnicity and other social identities are also important. And just sort of a general recognition that gender means not just female-headed households. So looking really at how gender plays out and how the household resource negotiation happens between men and women within the same household, and between men and women at the community level is important. I'm running out of time, so I will speed through this section. But how do we integrate gender in household surveys? What are the questions and how to ask them? And I say this as a person who comes from a quant background, but no survey should be designed without rigorous qualitative work. I think it is really helpful, like I said, to understand social norms that govern agriculture and other decision-making at the community and household level. There might be the socio-political institutions that influence intra-household bargaining power. And these could be things like inheritance laws, who owns assets, who gets to show that they own assets, rules around marriage and divorce, there is also an important role of migration and household decision making. And also, for example, in where people migrate to. So in areas in Nepal where men migrate to India, they still retain a lot of control over agriculture decision making because they are close by. They often make visits during peak agricultural season. Whereas in other areas of Nepal where migration is happening to West Asian countries of Saudi Arabia, UAE, or to Southeast Asian countries, not only are remittances higher, allowing potentially women to make greater investments in agriculture, but men are also not able to be as involved in agriculture, and so women there are expected to have to make more decisions are more empowered to make agricultural decisions in the absence of men. And so qualitative evidence helps us get at all of these nuances that we can then incorporate into our surveys, and that allows us to formulate specific research questions that are relevant to gender and inclusion. So there are a couple of areas of gender-specific questioning, including time allocation and women's empowerment, other indicators of bargaining, aspirations, and nutrition. I've already covered some of them. I just want to take a minute to kind of talk about the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. So in the WEA, the focus is on agency, which is often operationalized in terms of decision-making. And the reason for that is that when WEA was being sort of developed, there were already indicators that measured resources and they measured achievement, but we knew very little about how to measure agency, and that is the gap that WEA fills. So the WEA is an aggregate of two indexes. There are 5 domains of empowerment that cover production, resources, income, leadership, and time. And then there's a gender parity index that covers intra-household empowerment between men and women in the same household. So this is what the main sort of original WEA looked like, made out of 10 indicators. And over time, it was felt that we needed maybe a shorter version of the WEA that allowed us to still measure some of these indicators of empowerment while taking up less time. And so that kind of evolved into the abbreviated WEA, which is 6 indicators still covering production, resources, income, and leadership and time. And that is what we are hoping to include in our surveys as well. And thank you for listening. And that's a wrap from me. Stefan, over to you.
Super, thank you, Musa. I think we have maybe time for one very short question and a brief answer. Claudia, did you identify one of the most interesting questions? Or should we ask our two speakers about the Ukraine impacts?
Yeah, I guess
Over to you, Claudia.
Yeah, I mean, there is this one question on how to reflect agrobiodiversity indicators in the surveys. I think that's excellent. So that's is a activity under work package 1, and I think there'll be we definitely will need some very close interactions to make it a viable survey. That means it doesn't go on for too many hours, and to add some indicators that are useful then for work package 1 as well. And I also just put in the chat that we are in touch with Jules Colomer. He's responsible for designing the annual report for all of the initiatives. He sent a draft around, but to me, it was very vague on actual reporting requirements and indicators we really have to report on. My understanding is there's a lot of leeway, but then, we don't want to suddenly be surprised, and be told, oh, you need to report on 50 indicators and we have no collected information on them. So yeah, that's a dialogue that's also ongoing. And so all of that will feed into this questionnaire. And as you've seen, we're currently not, trying to do that in all of the geographies. So it's more like a rollout, starting in a few and then moving to other geographies. I don't know, Musa, anything on the agrobiodiversity indicator from your side, or it's basically a dialogue that needs to be had. Yeah. Okay. Good. Great.
Good. I'm afraid we wanted to do it in 45 minutes. We learned in our first seminar series that this is a challenge. People probably plan more for 60 minutes. And but with this, important to keep the time. Many of us have to hop to the next meeting, or if you're in Asia, you might better call it a day by now. And so I would like to thank, again, a big applause to our two speakers. Thank you to Musa and Shilp. We really enjoyed it. The chat box is full of questions for you, and this was a good start. Thank you. The next seminar will be advertised shortly. And volunteers, speakers, please raise your hand and contact us. We will be happy to include you. Thank you so much. Have a nice evening. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.